Want to know which major city goes underwater first? It's probably not the one you think, and the timeline is far more interesting than the usual 2100 and we're doomed story. I mapped every stage of sea level rise across thousands of years, from the first meter that erases countries to the full 70-meter scenario that changes every coastline on Earth. What is surprising is how some frozen regions become prime land while major capitals just disappear. This is a what-if scenario, a map exploration, no hype or apocalypse. We're just following the water forward through time to see how the planet changes. Okay, so before we jump into the far future stuff, let's talk about what's actually going on right now. Because even the small changes we're seeing today, they tell you a lot about where certain cities are already at their limits. Since the late 1800s, sea levels have risen about 21 to 24 centimeters. That's roughly 9 inches. Not too dramatic, right? But the rate is accelerating. And even these small increases are enough to show you which coastal cities are living on borrowed time. So let me start with Jakarta, Indonesia. The problem isn't just the rising sea, it's that the city itself is collapsing. Parts of North Jakarta are sinking at an alarming rate, up to 25 centimeters per year. That's nearly 10 inches annually. And this isn't a natural disaster. It's a man-made crisis, driven by illegal wells and the fact that 97% of the city is paved over with concrete. The inevitable conclusion? The Indonesian government looked at the math and said, you know what, we're out. They're building an entirely new capital, 1,200 miles away. That's 10 million people being told their city has an eviction notice. Meanwhile, Bangkok sits at an average elevation of 1.5 meters above sea level, only about 5 feet. This low-lying position made the 2011 monsoon flooding devastating. It killed over 500 people and left a fifth of the city underwater. And the city is still sinking, more than a centimeter every year. And some scientists estimate that by 2050, a third of Bangkok could be permanently underwater, not during storms, just underwater. And then there's Miami. Environmental writer Jeff Goodell called it the poster child for a major city that's not going to make it. Now, Florida has invested over $4 billion trying to save Miami Beach. And here's the thing about Miami that no one talks about enough. The city sits on porous limestone. That means even if you build a 20-foot wall around the entire city, water still seeps in through the ground during high tides. You can't wall off the ocean when the ocean just comes from below. That means even on a perfect afternoon, water can just bubble up through the streets. No storm, just high tide. Okay, so by the year 2100, that's only 75 years from now, we're looking at somewhere between 0.6 and 2.2 meters of sea level rise, depending on emissions. And with just 2 meters, here's what happens. New Orleans becomes almost impossible to defend. The city's already below sea level at so many areas. Add 2 more meters, and you're looking at catastrophic failure of the levee system during any major storm. Meanwhile, the Vietnam Mekong Delta, which feeds about 20 million people, loses massive amounts of farmland. And across the globe, Alexandria, Egypt watches 2,000 years of history just sink into the Mediterranean Sea. But that's just this century. That's the realistic near-term scenario. Now let me show you the what if. What if we keep going? What happens when we truly let the water take over? Alright, so this is where the map becomes a thought experiment. A what if deep dive. There's about 5 million cubic miles of ice on Earth right now. It's stored in 3 main places: mountain glaciers around the world, Greenland's massive ice sheet, and Antarctica, both the east and the west side. If all that ice melts, sea levels rise about 70 meters. That's roughly 230 feet, or the height of a 23-story building. Now this doesn't happen overnight. This would take thousands of years at current rates, longer than every human civilization that's ever existed. But different ice melts at different speeds, which means the world changes in stages. Cities drown in a sequence. So let's watch it happen step by step. And trust me, some of these are crazy. Let's start at the beginning. Just 1 meter of sea level rise. At first glance, it doesn't look that bad. But zoom in. The Maldives? Gone. Marshall Islands? Gone. And these aren't hypothetical dots on a map. The Maldives has a population of 500,000 people. The government is already purchasing land in other countries to relocate the population. These are entire cultures, languages, and nations that will cease to exist. Where do they go? They become the world's first true climate refugees, people without a country. Now over to Venice, Italy, which has been slowly sinking for centuries, is completely submerged. St. Mark's Basilica, which has stood for over 1,000 years, is now flooded. At 1 meter, Miami Beach is gone. The lower wards of New Orleans are permanently flooded, not just during hurricanes, but all the time. Now look at the Netherlands on this map. At 1 meter, it looks like half the country is underwater. But here's where human engineering matters. The Netherlands has been fighting water for years. They've built some of the most sophisticated flood defense systems on Earth, massive dikes, storm surge barriers, and sand replacement programs where they literally dump millions of tons of sand on beaches to build them back up. According to their Delta program, they're currently upgrading these systems to handle up to 3 meters of sea level rise by 2050 at the latest. They're raising dikes before they need to be raised, creating room for rivers to expand, and replacing storm surge barriers before they reach their end of life. So technically, the Netherlands could survive the first few meters while other places drown. But here's the thing, they can only do this because they're one of the wealthiest countries in the world, with centuries of engineering expertise and massive government investment. Unfortunately, Bangladesh doesn't have that luxury, and neither does Vietnam, or do most of the coastal nations facing the same flooding. The Netherlands proved you can engineer your way out of 1 to 3 meters of sea level rise. But that only buys you time, because what comes next is where even the best engineering starts to fail. Now let's add the ice from Greenland. That's 7.4 meters of sea level rise. We're sitting at roughly 7 to 8 meters total now. And this is where major cities start to fall, not just flooding, actual cities vanishing. New York City. At 7 meters, most of Manhattan is underwater. JFK Airport is gone. Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, massive flooding. The Statue of Liberty is standing in the ocean with water halfway up her pedestal. She now has a front row seat to the flooded city. The historic downtown of Boston is underwater. Philadelphia's entire waterfront district is destroyed. In Washington, D.C., the National Mall is partially flooded. You could kayak from the Lincoln Memorial to the Capitol building now. And in Florida, Miami, Tampa, and Jacksonville, all underwater, leaving the Central Florida area isolated. The happiest place on Earth is safe for now, but if the water keeps rising, that dream ends too. The coastline of the state is practically gone. On the west coast, San Francisco's hills become a small cluster of islands. The Golden Gate Bridge connects 2 islands now. And here's a weird one. California's Central Valley becomes a massive inlet sea. Sacramento, which is currently 120 miles from the ocean, is now a coastal city. The Pacific has pushed that far inland. And the Gulf of California expands so far north that Palm Springs, currently a desert resort town 100 miles inland, sits on a beachfront now. Palm Springs goes from landlocked desert to seaside resort. But that's just some of North America. Over in Asia, Shanghai is devastated. This is a city with 28 million people. At 7 meters, massive portions are underwater. Tokyo's coastal areas are submerged as well. And Bangladesh, a nation of 170 million people crammed into an area smaller than Iowa, it starts to disappear into the Bay of Bengal. Where do 170 million people go? Moving to Europe, London. The Thames Barrier, which was built to protect against a once-in-a-century flood, is completely overwhelmed. Major parts of the city are underwater. Remember the Netherlands? Even with all their engineering, at 7 meters, they're starting to lose ground. Their defenses can handle 3 meters, maybe stretch it to 5, but 7 meters is pushing past what's possible. But it doesn't stop there, because what happens next is where the planet starts to look truly different. West Antarctica's ice sheet collapses. That's another 3 to 5 meters. We're sitting at roughly 15 to 20 meters of total sea level rise. And this is where continent scale changes begin, where new oceans form that haven't existed in millions of years. Now the Amazon basin floods and becomes a massive shallow inland sea, cutting across South America. The rainforest we know today is mostly underwater, replaced by a giant saltwater bay. Southeast Asia becomes a collection of deep bays extending far inland. Cambodia's delta expands dramatically. Vietnam's coastline has moved hundreds of miles inland. Now look at China. At 20 meters, there is simply no escaping the water for the world's most populous nation. Over 600 million people live in the submerged zones. All gone or severely flooded. That's 600 million people. That's nearly double the entire population of the United States. Where do they go? In South America, a bunch of cities are gone at this point. Buenos Aires, Argentina, underwater. Montevideo, Uruguay, gone. Rio de Janeiro's famous beaches, they've been underwater since about 10 meters. The whole coastal city is flooded. The entire U.S. Atlantic seaboard from Boston down to Miami is now just a massive bay. Interstate 95, the major highway that runs the entire East Coast, is an underwater road. The most direct route from Boston to Miami would be on a nautical chart. At 20 meters, you start to see why scientists talk about tipping points. But there's still one more ice sheet, the big one. Now we're talking about East Antarctica. This is the ice sheet that holds about 58 meters of sea rise potential. That's 4/5 of all the ice on the entire planet. This ice has survived millions of years of climate swings, but if temperatures keep rising past a certain threshold, this will eventually melt too. We are now at 50 meters, 165 feet of sea level rise. Look at the map. The world you recognize, the coastlines that structured recent human history, are simply gone. At this stage, inland capitals are underwater. Berlin, a major European capital that's currently 100 miles from the coast, is submerged. That's how far inland the water pushes. The British Isles become a scattered archipelago. London has been gone for a while now. What remains of Britain is just the Highlands of Scotland, Wales, and a few elevated areas of England. Ireland, too, is reduced to its central and western mountains, with Dublin and Cork submerged. And here's a crazy one. The Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, they merge into one giant body of water. So now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan, all landlocked countries today, suddenly have coastlines. The Persian Gulf expands dramatically. The entire country of Qatar is gone. Bahrain is gone. And Baghdad, one of the oldest inhabited cities in human history, is underwater. Over in the southeast, Australia's coastal population centers, Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, they've all been functionally wiped out a long time ago. But the changes don't stop there. The continent develops a massive inland sea right in the middle of the outback. And here's the thing, this actually existed millions of years ago. There used to be a giant inland ocean in Central Australia. At 50 meters of sea level rise, it comes back. Now, at 70 meters, the full melt scenario, we are talking about 3 billion people displaced. That's 40% of the world's current population living in these zones that are now underwater. But as we look at this map, here's the final brutal twist. Remember Antarctica? The frozen wasteland that's been completely uninhabitable for millions of years. With all the ice gone, it emerges as a land with actual rock, soil, and temperate zones. The cruel irony? New land appears in Antarctica, just as 3 billion people are displaced. But it's not exactly a fair trade. Most of humanity's infrastructure, city, and agricultural land is underwater. And in exchange, we get a remote, rocky continent that would take centuries to develop. It's like offering a life raft, but it's 9,000 miles away from where the people are floating. Sure, it's there, but good luck getting to it. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. When does this actually happen? The good news, if you can call it that, is that the full 70-meter scenario would take approximately 5,000 years at current ice melting rates. That's longer than all of recorded human history. But here's what people miss when they hear that number. The timeline doesn't matter as much as the path we're on. Right now, Antarctica is losing about 150 billion metric tons of ice per year. Greenland is losing 266 billion tons. That's over 400 billion tons of ice disappearing into the ocean every single year. And the rate is accelerating. Scientists have calculated that if atmospheric CO2 levels reach between 500 and 800 parts per million, Antarctica's ice sheets hit a tipping point where melting becomes irreversible, even if we later reduce emissions. As of May 2025, we hit a seasonal peak of 430.5 parts per million. That's a new record. If we maintain even the lower rate of 2.5 parts per million per year, we hit 500 parts per million around 2054. That's less than 30 years from now. And once we cross it, even if it takes another 5,000 years for all the ice to fully melt, the process becomes unstoppable. So, can we adapt? Can we build or engineer our way out of this? Some places can, for a while. The Netherlands invests billions in widening rivers, raising dikes, and constructing massive storm surge barriers. But this isn't a scalable solution for all. For most of the planet, the problem is porous rock, sinking land, bad geography, or lack of resources. At human timescales, the story is about the first 1 to 2 meters of sea level rise. That's what's happening this century. That's where cities decide how to adapt, which coastlines to defend, and which to let go. By 2100, we're realistically looking at 0.6 to 2.2 meters depending on emissions. That alone displaces hundreds of millions of people. So if we don't change the trajectory, if we cross that CO2 threshold, then my great-great-great-grandchildren inherit a planet that's probably already committed to this 70-meter future, even if it unfolds over thousands of years. So here's what gives me a little hope. A bunch of countries have signed the Paris Climate Accords. Global investment in renewable energy has risen like crazy. Countries like Iceland and Norway already produce over 75% of their power from renewables, including solar, wind, and hydropower. So some solutions exist. What we need is the political will to deploy them globally, at scale, before we look into those long-term changes. When you look at your city on a map now, it's easy to think that coastlines are permanent. That the world your grandparents knew is the world that your grandchildren will inherit. But maps aren't permanent. They're snapshots. And Earth's coastline have always moved. Just usually over millions of years, not centuries. The question isn't whether sea levels will rise. They already are. The question is how much, how fast, and whether we're okay with the path we're on. That choice defines this century, and the map of the future will reflect our answer. Alright guys, so now you've seen which cities go underwater and when. And if you want more deep dives into maps, geography, and the what-if scenarios like this, hit the like and subscribe button. I really appreciate it. See you in the next one.